Okay, so to complete our journey today into knowledge of language and that approach that we've been taking with mental grammar, let us briefly consider two perspectives, one of which we, of course, have been taking, but another one which is perhaps something that some of you have been thinking about, and of course that has cropped up a lot in the reading, and that is the externalist perspective that is quite opposed to what we do. But before we dive into that, let me just tell you a little personal anecdote. So I have a sister who is 1 year younger than me, and we, of course, grew up together in our family. We went to the same kindergarten, the same preschool, the same primary school. After that, went our separate ways. But so, we shared a lot of our environment. It wasn't very terribly different. In fact, also, our friends significantly overlapped for the earlier part of our lives. And now, in German, there are two ways to say at work. So you can say, as in example 1 here, bei der Arbeit, which is literally at the work, or you can say auf der Arbeit, on the work. Has a bit to do with how you semantically construe a workplace. But in any case, in the south, where I'm from, most people have a preference for one, but generally tend to accept two. However, personally, my experience with myself and my sister is slightly different. So to me, both are acceptable, but I have a pretty strong preference for two, actually. And I'm not entirely sure where that comes from. But an interesting thing is that my sister thinks that sentence 2 is very definitively totally unacceptable to her. So if you say that and you ask her about that, she will say, no, that's not possible. That's not a possible sentence of the language that she speaks. And she only ever uses the construction number 1 here. So that little example just raises an interesting question, right? Given the sort of perspective that we've been taking and giving consideration to, whatever it is that we've sort of defined as language so far, well, when we talk about a language like German or English or whatever, we could ask in this situation, well, do we speak the same language, right? Do we both speak German? If we disagree on these things, right? If my sister thinks something that's part of my mental grammar and that's accepted by some other German speakers is really ill-formed, it doesn't seem to be part of her mental grammar, then can we really say that we speak the same language, right? And so that we're going to just leave out there. And I'm sure, a lot of you have similar experiences with friends that you grew up with other siblings, and so on. It's just a little illustration how different our individual grammars can be, even if the environment is very similar. So we've, of course, been taking the perspective that we're calling I language, right? We have sort of steered around that terminology for a bit now, but you've been well exposed to it all over the place every now and then. So, let's have a little look at what we did, how we got there, and what we mean by that. So we've been consistently arguing from the start that what we're interested in, that the object of our inquiry is knowledge of language. And we said that knowledge of language essentially is instantiated in the mind-brain of individual humans, right? So my sister and I and you, right? We have concrete instantiations of some body of knowledge that we might call knowledge of language in each of our mind-brains. Some part of that is genetically determined, right? Or genetically endowed. We have an ability for language that a lot of other animals don't have. Closely related primates, bonobos, and so on, don't have a faculty for language. Frogs don't have a faculty of language. I don't know, whatever you can think of. Right? Humans are the only ones that we know of that have this faculty of language. So there's a genetic part to it. But then, of course, there's the other part of that knowledge, right, or that ability, that is specific to each individual, right? So in this idealization idea of the faculty of language or of language in general, we sort of said, well, let's discount sort of performance factors, things that we don't have in control, right? I'm pretty tired. Maybe, that leads to imperfect performance of the competence that I have, right? That we're sort of leaving out, and that gives us this idealized idea that we all basically have the same faculty of language, but what makes us different is the part that is learned. So there is some part that is specific to each individual. It's principally determined by the environment that you grew up in. So the input data that you were exposed to, but also by your internal states and your individual differences, right? I mean, if you're a little bit hard of hearing, or your attention and intentions are somewhere else, right, then you might pick up different things. And so perhaps what happened with my grammar is that I happened to have a couple of friends that perhaps used that, or there were people around and I felt like those were better examples. Who knows what exactly happened, but it led to a different internal state than it did for my sister, right? Those environmental factors. And so really when we're talking about KOL, on the one hand we're talking about this biologically endowed factor, the capability, and then on the other hand we're talking about a concrete internal state that exists in the mind brain of all of us that has a component there that's environmentally and internally motivated, right? So it's really about an internal state. And we also argued that mental grammars are intentional systems, right? That an extensional qualification is not a good one, and that it's actually not the most interesting thing to think about the list of all the things that we can produce, but what is really special about language is the fact that we can combine it and use it in certain ways. It's creativity, it's things like recursion, right? Infinite embedding. Those kinds of factors are really interesting, and they are best defined intentional as a computational system in the mind. So this individual, internal, intentional system that's somehow contained in some human's mind brain, right? That we call an I language. So I have an I language in my brain, you have an I language in your brain, my sister has an I language in her brain, right? And they're all slightly different. They share some part, right? And that's that faculty of language part, right? Sometimes we might call universal grammar. And then there are lots of factors that depend on the individual. So that's the view that we take. And under this I language view, we pretty much have no reason to expect that any two humans should have exactly the same mental grammar, right? There's some part that we expect to stay constant, so all these things that come as part of the biological endowment for the faculty of language, we would expect to stay constant, right? So all languages have creativity, all languages have infinite embedding. Those are some of those factors that we expect every language to have because it's part of that biological endowment. We expect that every human, right, barring some sort of clinically significant neurodevelopmental issues, has the capability to learn a language quite rapidly, right, and roughly along the same line, for example. Restrictions like star ABA, right, those are shared across all humans, and then the rest, right, is different from individual to individual. So there's no real comparison, right? We can't say that, even though, genetics or whatever might be quite similar, especially, if I had a brother, perhaps even more. So this is a very individualistic, internalistic, and intentional view of language. And all these things start with an I, of course, and that's why we call it an I language. Now, there are some people that take a different view, and something we might describe as E language. And in fact, when you talk to people sort of, in everyday conversation, where it's not always completely clear and completely significant, but also when you talk to people, that are from different corners of psychology perhaps, or philosophy, you'll often encounter that they don't agree with that idea of language as I language. You even find such people in linguistics or especially in philology departments. So most people, when they think of language, in fact, outside, linguistics departments, don't think of language as I language. Right? They think of things like German, English, Wari, Warlpiri, Welsh, you name it, Mandarin Chinese. And so really what they do is they think of that as an entity in itself that is tied to a speech community and a shared body of knowledge that exists within that community. Right? So language is sort of in their own right is something that arises between a speech community. And that means that language for them is something that's external to the individual speaker, right? So quite radically different from the point that we get at with this I language view. They think, well, the individual speaker doesn't matter so much, right? Language exists somehow external to the individual, outside of the individual, independent of the individual, if you will, and is an entity in itself, and those sort of things we might call German, English, Wari, Warlpiri, and so on. And so if we try to define an instance of such an entity, we might say it's the corpus of all the utterances that exist in that speech community. Right? And then sometimes people sort of disagree. Right? And some people might say, well, it's all the ones that are actually out there, that actually exist. Right? So, every book that exists in that speech community and every sentence that's ever been spoken qualifies. And then some say, well, there are also sentences that, are possible, but that haven't been spoken in that community, right? So, something that we had before, property like infinite embedding would allow, and so on. So you might say, well, the corpus of hypothetical utterances that the speech community would be accepting of, if you will. And so this external conception of language, and there are, really a lot of fine-grained differences that people might want to draw, right? That's why, I put the brackets there and I said, might define this way or that way. But the important thing is it's saying, seeing language as something in its own right that exists independently of its individual speakers. We call that E-language, right? E for external, perhaps also E for extensional, which is a point we'll get to in just a moment. And so under this E-language view, a grammar has to principally describe all the possible utterances in a speech community's collective output. And that, of course, raises lots of questions, right? It's like who is part of that speech community, for example. But an important point that I want to make just before we move to a discussion of those issues is this point of an utterance, right? It's a term that I've used a couple of times now. And when I spoke about I language, I usually said sentences. And so there's a distinction that we often draw where we say utterances are the things that you actually produce, the performance, while a sentence, as such, is a mental object, right? The mental object that comes out of your mental grammar before it's sort of executed and pronounced. And so this is about performance, not about competence, right? I language very closely linked to the idea of competence, E language very closely linked to the idea of performance, because it's based on all the things that have been externalized by the speakers. All right, so let's have a little think about, a juxtaposition of these two positions. So an I language is, a very well-defined object of study. In fact, there's sometimes this idea that language is not somehow, physically real. But if you take this I language perspective, well, yes, it is a physically real object that we're studying, right? It's part of the mind, that's part of the brain. And so ultimately, even if we have not a clue and we don't understand how the brain does it, it's somehow encoded in your brain, it's somehow encoded in my brain, right? So roughly speaking, there is a physical object, a physical collection of neurons that interact with each other and so on, that constitutes that faculty of language, that constitutes my knowledge of language, right? That's physically somewhere located in here in my head, right? So in the head of every human, there is a physical object, and those are the physical objects that we study, and we're looking at what do they have in common, and what's different about them. Right? So this is a very well defined, locatable thing that we're looking at. Now, that's not the case with E-language. Right? An E-language is quite difficult to define, in fact. So, well, how do we know whose utterances count as part of the language and whose don't? Right? Think back of that anecdote I told at the very start with me and my sister. Well, my sister is very adamant that what I'm producing is not part of her language. So if enough people in that speech community decide that, then who gets to decide whether I'm a German speaker or my sister is, or we both are, or neither of us is? That's a very difficult question, and as far as I can tell and as far as I know, nobody has ever been able to give a very good definition. What should be included and what shouldn't. Also think about the time differences, right? I mean, younger speakers often have a different grammar, language changes, than older speakers. Some people die, but the utterances survived. We've written them down in corpora. So do these things still count? Well, how far back do you go? When do you draw the line? Is Middle English still part of the English E-language? I don't know. But if we draw the line there, why not draw the line at yesterday? So there are lots of definitional problems, and there are no really objective cutoff points that we can draw in a very useful manner. It's a lot about, the intuition or the feeling of people that use E-language as a concept that they try to study. There's no such thing as a completely homogeneous speech community, right? So just like my sister and I disagree on that little snippet of our grammars, it's the case that there are probably no two humans on planet Earth that have ever lived that had exactly the same knowledge of language in their mind brain. And that implies, of course, that there is no such thing as a speech community that all stick to the same rules and conventions when producing utterances. And therefore there's always going to be a super grammar, if I take this E-language approach, for lack of a better word, right? So ideally, the possible outputs that every individual of the speech community can produce are a subset of what is covered in the E-language. And so the E-language, you can imagine, gets quite large and quite an unwieldy thing, and perhaps the explanatory principles that I might try and come up with for a grammar like that, whatever it would mean to explain that thing, could be quite random and might not necessarily have anything to do with what really is possible on an individual level. You might ask yourself, well, what is the difference between a language and a dialect? It's not easy to draw a cutoff line and say, well, mutual intelligibility is the issue here, right? If two speakers understand each other, say, 98% of the time, then they're part of the same speech community. But the thing is that dialects don't often have hard borders, but they change very gradually. And so if you have some distance, people can't understand each other anymore. But if you keep the distance small, from village to village to village to village, people understand each other. So how bounded is any E-language? Right? Especially if those are bigger languages like the German language family, which stretches all the way from Denmark down into the northern parts of Italy. You can imagine there is a vast difference between those speakers at the extreme ends. And you might not necessarily want to say they speak the same language, but you might be forced to if you look at the people in between every time. You can never draw the line. And so I think I've already given that away, right? But my sister and I, clearly in the I-language definition, don't share a grammar, right? Our grammar is different. Even if only in that minute detail, if it was the same in every other regard, we'd still have individual different I-languages. But we can't really say that but the question might be, could we really say that we speak the same E-language? Especially if she insists that my utterance is not part of the language that she speaks, right? So maybe you might say, well, I'm leaving it up to the speakers. They know if they speak the same language. Well, but then if one of them produces weird sentences and weird grammar, it doesn't stick to the rules that I believe in, I don't know, right? So it raises a lot of problems and a lot of questions of how useful that concept really is. And if you can't delineate what you're studying and what your theory is about, then, that says something about the quality of the guess and the power of the consequence that it can compute, and, the power of the checking in with nature. Because if the whole point is precision at the whole point, so I know exactly when I'm wrong, and if, at every single point the concepts are ill-defined or not definable, and I can't concretize them, then that raises a lot of issues, right? And for that reason, a lot of people, especially that take our perspective, right, start from sort of a biological, cognitive science, internalist perspective, have very big doubts about whether, e-language can in any sense be studied according to the principles that we have called scientific. So in any case, let's have a little comparison, right? Because a lot of the time there are corollaries that go with either position. So, as an I linguist, I make a lot of assumptions that are very different to those that a lot of E linguists make. And that's quite important to keep in mind, especially when you're confronted with people that have different positions. It can be quite useful to know that usually there are a number of assumptions that go together on the one side and a number of assumptions go together on the other side. Now, I have to say, just before we go through that, and I'll, if I remember, try and remind you at the end again, that on an individual basis, that's not necessarily true for everyone, right? So there might be I linguists that, take some of the positions here that I'm attributing to E linguists, and there might be some E linguists that agree with some of the ideas that I attribute mainly to I linguists, right? But this is sort of a heuristic, right? So the idea in this table that we're going to build is that typically a typical I linguist and a typical E linguist, right, will subscribe to those kinds of ideas. And so typically an I linguist will believe in nativism. Nativism is a modern instantiation of an older Platonic principle called innatism. And the fundamental idea is that when it comes to informational learning, right, so, babies are born, that their brains are not just completely empty, but that their brains are already filled with structures, and they have, they're endowed with learning biases and things that are specific to certain tasks that a human in this case, but also, that applies to other animals, they're meant to do that, right? So they have, this is why Steven Pinker called this book the language instinct, right? You might say, their brain is genetically determined to develop an instinct to learn language, for example, or if you're a bonobo to learn, the bonobo ape calls, whatever it might be. On the other hand, E-linguists typically subscribe to empiricism. The fundamental idea of empiricism, this is not note about the fact, whether you're using empirical data or not. As you have seen, right, our discipline is an empirical science, right? We're, making our calls at the end of the day based on data that we observe in the world and what nature has to say. So, we're empirical too. But empiricism here stands in contrast to nativism. And the idea of empiricism is that the brain
is a blank slate,
if you will, right? What's technically called a tabula rasa. And so humans, they don't argue that humans don't have any learning mechanisms, but they argue that there's nothing that's specialized in the brain, right? You don't have a special learning mechanism for balance, you don't have a special learning mechanism for language, you don't have a special learning mechanism for, vision or, any domain of learning that occurs for maths, whatever. There's nothing genetically endowed that makes you specifically, learn one thing in a certain way. You might have some general things like, you might be good at keeping track of statistics and so on. There's also a linked position that's actually often taken by our linguists nowadays called emergentism, which is something you can look up if you find that interesting, that idea. But so empiricists believe that, there's nothing special about the brain when it comes to, genetic endowments that predispose you to develop a certain faculty or acquire certain knowledge. And certainly they would deny something like universal grammar, right? That the faculty of language somehow comes preset with certain rules that you never have to learn. And then, we looked at competence. right? We're interested in the internal knowledge, and really what we're interested when we say competence, we're interested in the faculty of language and the possibilities that it allows. On the other hand, e-linguists are interested, I've said before, in the collection of utterances that collectively exist, and that's part of performance. There's no other way if you're an externalist, right? It's sort of in the definition, you're caring about the outside language, so that's already been performed, if you will. As I-linguists, we aim for intentional adequacy, right? We don't just want something that gives us the right output for the grammar of a speaker, but we have this demand of ourselves that somehow we properly model what we think the process actually looks like. Psychological reality, if you will, is an aim for us. On the other hand, for an e-linguist, that can't play a role, right? Because they don't care about the internal mental states of people. They care about the stuff that comes out. And so for them, really, the aim is done if they have something that's extensionally equivalent, right? That is capable of producing the exact extensional set of all the utterances in that language, then that's good enough. It doesn't matter if my model is based on rewrite rules or if it's based on counting or whatever, right? Because I'm not trying to model something that the brain does. It doesn't have to conform to this or that or whatever. As long as I have a model that gives me that set, I can define that set well, and then I'm done. So that's enough for them. As I-linguists, we try to come up with explanatory theories that model mental processes, right? It's computational processes that are happening. And also, of course, the representations that are involved in them, quite importantly, right? And so we're trying to explain how do these processes work, what do they rely on, what are the kinds of representations that we can store and that we can't, perhaps. While on the other hand, an e-linguist is interested in a descriptive analysis that makes generalizations over the data, right? So they're looking at a big corpus of data of, all the possible utterances in English, whatever that means, and they will perhaps try and draw generalizations across that data, right? Like, typically the convention seems to be that a definite article goes before a noun, right? That's a descriptive analysis they can draw out of that, right? And that's, you might say, is a defining characteristic of English, as opposed to, say, a language that marks definiteness with a suffix. Now, with this internalist state, right, and the commitment to nativism, to some, biological endowment, comes for us, as I-linguists, the idea that, well, yeah, if there's part that's biologically endowed and hardwired, then there are things about language that are universal. And then you've been reading about this idea, and you've seen glimpses of it in the kinds of grammars that we constructed. Languages seem to have parameters, right? So a lot of the time, the learning task, if you assume that they're born with something, becomes quite trivial. So, for example, with the stress thing we briefly mentioned, and you saw in the reading, if you went through the same examples, that there is a language that, instead of going from right to left, goes from left to right, right? And so a child just has to figure out, is my language going right to left or left to right? Right? And then it can apply the algorithm and has already sorted the stress system of half the languages that have a computed stress system. That's not the case if you take an e-language perspective. If you take an e-language perspective, then it's about conventions and behaviors, right? Because that corpus is produced by a speech community, a community of speakers that are interacting. The best thing that you can say about that is, well, that they have certain conventions, and what it's about for an individual in that community is learning the conventions and the acceptable behaviors, acceptable verbal behaviors, if you will, of that community, right? And there's a trade, perhaps, right? Compromises being made and whatever, but sooner or later you have to conform to society, right? And that's sort of how they have to explain whatever generalizations they find in their data that are different from others. It arises from that interaction, from social convention. We study cognitive abilities as I-linguists, right? We see ourselves as in a larger picture, right? Language is a cognitive ability, something that the mind does. That's to do with input-output processing and so on. whilst e-linguists study corpora and communities, right? So the only two factors, and some of them study only corpora, right? Only the outputs. Some of them are really interested in the speech communities and conventions they have, right? And many of them are interested in both and think, language arises or exists because of the interaction of both these factors. But yeah, either you have a corpora, right, a collection of many utterances, or you have communities that produce them, right? And somehow they must interact, and that's the things that you can study if you don't want to look at that internal level. So that about sums up what we had to cover this week. We took a quick overview, starting from knowledge of language, and then going into extensional equivalence, right? The idea, what might that grammar look like that's there, right? And how is that represented in the mind, and how can we tell them apart? And right, and we sort of crystallized out this I language position that we had throughout, and then of course finished off by looking at, well, what else is out there, right? Because maybe you might be thinking we're not quite right, and actually just contrasting what we're doing to what some other people think, and very explicitly what we're not doing, that can also clarify the object of our study. So we'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the Q&A next Tuesday.